delighted today to introduce Sally So and Roger Lessing from the HSP Group. HSP is a global expansion group that supports companies to successfully enter new markets, and they are very well placed to advise today. Sally has spent her entire career in the global expansion services industry, helping clients ranging from very small startups to large Fortune 500 companies with anything from their tax, accounting, HR, payroll, mergers and acquisitions, and legal challenges. And Ryder works in HSP's partnership team and specializes in helping companies to navigate some of the most common challenges when setting up in the US, and to help prevent prolonged and very costly pitfalls. So I'll hand over now to Sally. As I said, there will be a Q&A at the end, so please pop your questions in the chat and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Sally, for the introduction. So as I've mentioned, Sally So, based out of our Boston office here at HSP. So if I move on, a quick overview of our agenda here. We essentially go through the A to Z of coming into the US. So we'll essentially start with understanding, first of all, how do we even set up an entity in the US? What are some of the considerations, pros, cons of each types? Then we'll go into sort of site selection, and then we'll go into more of the, I would say, hot topics, so the accounting and tax considerations, payroll and employment considerations, before we wrap it up at the end here. Yeah. Okay. So starting off with entity type, I think is probably the most common questions from all of my clients. We first like to understand, in order to operate a business here, of course, you need to have an entity. Usually in, I think, some of the other markets in EMEA, there is a concept of what's called a payroll only, or we call it non-resident employer. No such thing in the US, right? If you want to hire employees, start making sales, we highly recommend that you register some sort of entity type in the US. So there are different types. There's a branch office that is not seen as a separate legal entity from your own parent, right? So it's seen as an extension of the Irish parent. Pros and cons of that is, I would say from a complexity perspective in the US, it's fairly similar to a full-on incorporation of a full-blown separate entity. And it doesn't offer you that separate legal liability separation. So I would say 99% of the time, unless there's really some overarching operations or tax benefit from opening a branch, I would default to what we call a subsidiary. So a subsidiary is, as I mentioned here, it's a distinct separate legal entity. And that essentially will protect your parent, whether it's in Ireland or some other jurisdiction, from any, liability issues that arise from your US operations, right? So then from a subsidiary perspective, there's different types. I listed here the two most common, which are a limited liability company, which is an LLC for short, or a C corporation. That's probably more popular, a taxable corporation. There are other types, so S corporations, so partnerships, but we find with companies coming overseas, unless it really is small operations, like one or two owners, these two items here, LLC and C corp, are going to be the most popular. And really the big difference between the two is, I would say, top considerations is, does the company intend to go public? Yes or no, right? LLC, you will not be able to go IPO. C Corp will give you that flexibility. Usually LLCs are more flexible in terms of management. The reason why is there is no requirement to have a board of director. You can essentially have a team of managers, CEO, CFO, etc., and that's that. Whereas with the C Corp, you do need to assign the full board of directors that will have oversight over the management office, right? I think the third item that really sticks out between the two is the tax, right? So with the C corporation, we often find that there could be what we call double taxation, especially if you are a shareholder of the company. You will get taxed once on a corporate level, so the standard, 22%, but then once dividends are issued, then you get taxed again if you're a shareholder on those dividends, right? Whereas on the LLC, you could structure in a way where you can either be taxed solely, or there is definitely potential of double taxation, but I think there is more protection on the tax side of things. So I was saying those are really the three big differentiators between LLC and C corporation. And I will move on. Then the next steps is once we identify what type of entity do you want to set up is where do you want to incorporate, right? I think everyone can go on Google and understand that Delaware is usually the hot spot for where companies incorporate. I'd say 90% of my clients do choose to incorporate in Delaware. Very, very simple. It can be, you know, a click of a button done within 24 hours. I would like to advise folks that they take a step back and really understand what are your operations, right? So when you register to do business in Delaware, let's just say you have your operations in Wisconsin or Ohio or Illinois, which are really the big hubs for the industrial and agricultural businesses, you then have to have a subsequent registration to do business in that state. So I don't always advise clients to jump straight to Delaware unless you really have some sort of time commitment. Let's take a step back, do your homework and understand, number one, what are your key criteria, right? And so some of the hot items for consideration would be where your customer is located, because most likely you want to follow where your customer base is. Number two would be talent, right? If you intend to hire employees, which within this industry, it is very heavy. A lot of folks have to be on site. So you need to hire where you have employees. And then some of the other ones, of course, tax considerations, right? Certain states have higher taxes, some states have lower, as well as a wealth of tax incentive programs, which we'll get into a little bit later on. And then I would say the fourth tier is legislation, is how friendly is each state. So I like to say that when people are coming to the US, it's almost like coming into 50 many different states. Not only will you have the federal legislation governing, but then you will have the state by state legislation that you have to take into consideration. So for example, if you have an employee in California, I would say that is the probably most employer friendly state out of all of the US. So if we can focus on some of the other states, unless you really know that's top talent. So little considerations like that, right? And I would always advise that you take a look at that holistic picture and understanding, okay, out of those, 4 or 5 criteria that I listed, what is really crucial for you as a company, and then make your decision, right? Moving on. So now you know where you want to register. Usually the next approach is payroll, how do I hire employees, etc. I already mentioned it's like operating 50 different little countries, and each state has its different legislation. So I listed the 3 most common: employer record, professional employer organization, PEO, and local entity is essentially if you set up your local entity, and we call it a standalone payroll. Those are really the 3 options. And I'm going to start with EOR first. So EOR essentially is, I call it a quick and dirty way of entering the market and being able to hire folks. What's nice about it is you will not need to set up your entity, register for payroll purposes in the US before being able to hire this individual. The downside is that employer of record is essentially a third party that you hire to take on the onus of acting as the official employer that is doing that registration for you. So even though you're not doing that registration, the EOR provider will be doing that. And that means that they take care of all of the obligations, all the filing requirements, payroll, salaries, withholding, etc. But the downside is the name on the employment contract will indicate this EOR provider. However, it's only for back office, right? And compliance requirements. The day-to-day responsibilities and oversight of the employees will continue to be retained with your firm. So I see a lot of my companies that really just identify talent that's really crucial, want to get this employee on board, but they don't have the entity set up right away, will default to EOR, right? Now, the downside of that is it does not protect the company from what we call permanent establishment. So a lot of times when you have an employee, depending on the nature of activities, and we often say revenue generating activities or contract closing. So if they're signing, negotiating, and closing contracts in the US, that will essentially trigger corporate tax liability, which is the definition of permanent establishment in the US. That essentially will say that the company needs to register and be able to remit corporate tax to the US. So that needs to be very clear. As EOR means you don't need to register for anything. So obviously, if there was ever an audit and it's found that the activities of this employee triggers PE, there could be a potential corporate tax exposure to the company. And that's when we move on to that second and third tier PEO or a standalone payroll under your own entity. Under PEO, you will still need to set up an entity. However, you split it in two. We call it the co-employment strategy. So here, what's nice is you will still need to incorporate and register in each state that you will have an employee in. However, all of the back office will continue to be taken care of by the PEO firm. So they will take care of all of the mandatory HR reporting requirements in each state. They will do the remittances, etc. But it will be essentially a shared employment between both your company and this. Really, same thing. I think PEO is very quick, usually more cost efficient. And another pro with PEO versus operating your own standalone payroll is really in the US benefits is really costly, right? It's almost a mandatory item. I know it's supplementary benefits. There is no mandatory law that indicates you have to offer it. But really in the US, if you want to hire really great talent, it's almost an expectation that you will have some sort of minimal supplemental benefit plan to offer. Now, if you only have around 5 heads or less coming in, you're not going to be able to source your own corporate benefit plan that is one, cost efficient, or remotely going to offer the coverage level that your employees expect. So that's what's nice about a PEO firm. If you think about it, the PEOs consolidate hundreds and thousands of employees across multiple companies. So they actually have quite some sway and have quite good, robust benefit plans that can be offered to your employees. So that I generally find that that's one of the big decision factors of whether or not a company wants to do PEO versus operating your own separate payroll, which is this third option here. So under your own entity, a lot of folks are going to say, why would I want to run a PEO if I can essentially just process my payroll in-house, perhaps outsource it for a couple of bucks per payslip? It's for that items I mentioned. I would say this third option, definitely feasible. You can outsource it to a payroll processor. But the complexities of, let's just say you have employees in 10 states, you have to go and ensure that you are in compliance with all of those 10 states, right? Certain folks will have minimum like equity and diversity reporting requirements. It's not just payroll. There's different like insurance requirements if somebody goes out on leave. So all of those complexities you will have to handle in-house. So I do find, especially with companies coming in overseas, I don't even recommend that people go off and do their separate payroll under their own entity unless they really start reaching, you know, the hundreds of employees and have a dedicated HR manager that will be hired in-house to oversee it, right? Okay, moving on. And I did want to quickly touch base on IP and patents. It's very important from a brand recognition perspective. So a lot of folks always assume you can come in, essentially leverage your overseas IP registrations and go on your merry way and operating and doing business in the US. Not the case here. The same spiel you're going to hear me say over and over again is by state. I think it's very important for companies to recognize that while there are international agreements that do offer a level of protection for your host country IP rights, you will still have to go through registrations of your patent or your IP with the US Patent and Trademark Office. And it is quite a lengthy process. It can range from a couple of months to, I've seen it drag on for years, depending on the logo. Is there, you know, a similar company that's offering the same name? So really the takeaway here is just to ensure that you have a proper licensed lawyer that is looking into these registrations for you and getting that process started right away, right? And then that will trickle down into the contracting that I've mentioned here, is ensuring that your employment contracts as well as your vendor contracts all will reference those IP registrations and trademarks. The big one here. So I like to say probably next to like Mexico and Brazil, we have probably one of the more complex tax systems in the world here. So you'll see here, it's multi-tier. So we were going to have a federal, state, and sometimes on a local level, different taxes that will impact the company. And especially when it comes to the industrial and agricultural business, when it comes to equipment, all of that is tangible goods. So it's a no-brainer where sales tax is definitely going to apply. Of course, there's many exemptions that we'll talk into a little bit. But for example, if I was advising a service company or a SaaS company, usually that's on the lower end of concern from a sales tax perspective because they don't actually have a physical presence. So I think most of the customers on the webinar today, this is definitely a hot topic. It will definitely really be relevant for the team here. So in terms of corporate tax, you'll see here that depending on where you choose to register to do business, it can impact anywhere from 10 to 12% of a change, right? So federal right now is set at 21%, which is already quite significantly lower from what it used to be. It was 35%. Then when you go down to the state level, depending on which states you register in, it can be an additional 0 to 11.5%. And you have to think about, for example, if you are registering in multiple states, that is essentially varying percentages. So going back to what we discussed at the very beginning and understanding, choose wisely as to where you choose to incorporate and register to do business and choose to hire, because wherever you normally have a warehouse, have an office location, employees, you will have to register in that state to do business and be remitting state corporate tax on top of your federal tax return. It makes it more complex because if you think about going from having to file one single tax return to having to file, let's just say 11 tax returns, that adds to your compliance requirements and just the complexity of having to allocate your income amongst those different states to calculate those taxes. So all in all, that's what we're in the business of doing, right? Is ensuring that we are advising on the most cost-efficient way to register and be reporting taxes in a compliant manner. So that's corporate. I think sales tax is a whole different beast here. There is no federal sales tax rate. The sales legislations is essentially governed by the state, right? So you will have the state sales tax rate, and then some of those states will actually go down to the local level, down to the county or municipal. So for example, in New York, I think there were like 4 different tax rates because they have the state, the city, or the county, and then the city. And all that will add up to your total tax rate. Here it can range from none. For example, in New Hampshire, there is no sales tax, up to 9.55%. And some of the heavy, I think that was actually Pennsylvania. I think particularly with sales tax, another really crucial item is to really do your homework, right? When you trigger corporate tax, I would say corporate tax has a higher nexus threshold, meaning you may not need to register in that state right away if you have sales in that state. But when it comes to sales tax, I find that most companies would trigger that requirement to register more quickly. The reason why is usually nexus is, again, determined by physical presence. Do you have an employee there, physical office, etc.? Or often not, let's just say you don't have any physical presence there. It will be dictated by your customer levels, right? How many sales are you making in that state? What will be the sales tax liability if you were, and is that service or goods that you are selling even taxable? So especially in the agricultural business, which is great. I've seen that many companies do exempt agricultural, which is great. So hopefully this is just a moot point, but in the off case where that state does tax it, definitely, come to like some HSP or a tax advisor and just do your due diligence. Number 1, verify, is your operations taxable? Number 2, do you need to register? And number 3, what is your liability? Right. Okay.
Sally, I might just come in there with a question. If you could clarify for us the difference between state and local tax. That was a question that came in the chat.
Absolutely. So the state is on the state level. So the very, very top tier, the 50 states. Now, local is usually down to the city and the county, right? So those are all different governing tax authorities, and they have their own revenue departments that govern that state. So when I put here the 0 to 7% under the state, it's actually going to be in addition to the 0 to 7%. So it's not 7+7 because I think the 7% high in Pennsylvania, the local highest county rate in Pennsylvania was like 2.55%. So I don't want folks to think that the high rate in totality is going to be the 14%. Okay. So if I think about it, top federal, state, county, city, that's essentially our government system here in the US. Anything else there? Good. Okay. One of the other topics that do definitely come up with companies overseas is I often find that folks want to send people from Ireland over to the US to essentially be able to set up their initial operations, right? So first and foremost, immigration is a big item. It is becoming more and more complex and more difficult, if anything, to obtain the proper visas with recent political environments, obviously. So what I've listed here, a couple of the more common ones, the E1, E2, and L1. I think the biggest takeaway, again, is doing your homework is first, gather your documentation. You should always ensure that for that individual, have their resumes and CVs ready. A lot of these visas, for example, the L1 will require that the individual would have worked for the company for at least 1 year before you can essentially have them come over to the US on that L1 visa. So those are usually the basic information of CV. What is the job description of the role in the US? And having that immigration attorney review and confirm what is the appropriate visa that is fit for purpose. Then they will give you the list of criteria and then advise on next steps, timelines, etc. I find that it can range anywhere from 2 to 6 months, if not longer, for any one of these visas. There are expedited options here, but it will impact your operational timeline. So I always like to just throw in a slide here to say, it's not just timing of entity setup and setting up your back office, but if there are crucial personnel that have to come over, this definitely will play a heavy hitter into your timelines as well, right? And then another item of consideration will be, what is the end goal for the individual that's coming over here? So if it is just a short stint, what I call a short-term assignment ranging from 1 to 3 years, we would call that, either an expat, and you essentially will run what we call a shadow payroll. I'm saving that probably for a different webinar. Global mobility is a whole separate beast in itself. But that leads into my second point here is that may play a factor into what type of visa you go into, right? If there's a short-term stint, usually the visas that we've advised here will suffice. But if this individual wants to stay here long-term, now we have to start planning with that individual of, okay, do we need to help obtain a green card? Do they want to obtain their permanent residence here? That real long-term planning, and then going into, okay, how do we localize that individual? So converting him from a full-blown expat to actually a full-blown US national that is reporting in payroll Social Security. Okay, very good. And I think the last item we mentioned, it very much ties back to everything we talked about just now in terms of, what state to choose, tax implications. In the US, we have lots of very, very good, robust incentive programs that range from tax incentives to workforce incentives, meaning they may offer you a relief on your employer obligations, especially in your industry, as well as I already mentioned relief on the sales and use tax, or even offer grants, right? So a lot of these would be either a relief on your tax rate. So you will get a more preferential tax rate with the federal IRS. Down to the state level, I have seen, for example, certain states will offer grants if you come and choose to set up operations. It could be land grants if it's farming, or they will offer you R&D credits depending on what type of equipment or IP you're developing in the states here. So I would be, remiss to not mention that definitely does play a factor into your overall cost budgeting for the US. So we've listed a couple of the big markets here that do offer some pretty good, robust, healthy incentives. Again, our job here is to be able to advise based on your industry and the market that you're looking into, are there any applicable incentives or grants that you can leverage from? Okay. And then from here, I think I'll hand it over to my colleague Ryder.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sally. First of all, I really want to thank Enterprise Ireland for putting this webinar together. We're very lucky to be in collaboration with such a great organization, and hopefully we can be of help to some of the companies here that are looking to expand internationally and into the US. So my name's Ryder. I'm also based in the Boston hub here for HSP. And just to provide a bit more context on HSP Group, so we specialize in global expansion and compliance in over 100 plus countries and can be your trusted partner for inbound to the US. So our goal is to really help companies expand outside where they're headquartered, whether it be organic growth, first time expanding to a new country, help consolidate your back office operations under one partner, or through cross-border M&A. We really try to take a consultancy approach to come up with the best solution for your people and organization. And high level, there's really two sides to what we do. First being supporting your market entry and back office operations in the US in 100 plus countries. Usually that starts with entity setups to all the registrations needed in country, can help open up a bank account, provide registered address, and take care of all the annual filings, running payroll, handling HR, benefits, accounting, tax compliance. But there's also a consultancy side to our business. So that's where, I'd loop in members of the team like Sally, really do a deep dive of what you're looking to achieve overseas, to determine the level of footprint you're looking to establish, and cover some of the entity types and employment models Sally spoke about earlier. We also have an HR team that specializes in employment contracts, handbooks, benefits benchmarking, making sure you're compliant and a competitive employer in the US. We have some of the best GDPR experts in the industry to understand where your exposure may be. And overall, we really strive to help you navigate the complexities of doing business in the US, help with your overarching strategy, and hold your hand through that process. So I think that covers it from my side. Thanks everyone here today for joining, and Enterprise Ireland for putting this together. On the next slides, our contact information if you have any questions, and I believe we're moving to a Q&A session now. Thanks so much.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Sally and Ryder. A lot covered there, and a lot more to it would probably just scratch the surface. But if you have follow-up questions for Sally and Ryder, their details are on the screen and they're always happy to chat. And we have got a few great questions in through the chat. So I might just dive into them. There's one here: if you register as an LLC, can you convert to a C Corp later on?
Yes, absolutely. That's actually one of the great benefits of operating in the US, is quite common. Of course, I always like to say, do your homework. So before you jump into it, always make sure you have a proper lawyer and tax advisor that has reviewed and taken a look at all of the implications and the tax impacts of doing so. But in short, yes, there's different methods. You can either merge the company or essentially do a statutory consolidation of the companies. So it definitely is a yes. What I see most companies would do is the LLC members will be converted into shareholders of the C corporation, and then the companies are essentially amalgamated together.
Great. And you touched on something there, which is lawyers and accountants, etc., and having good ones in place. And one of the questions that did come in was, what are the benefits of using, for example, accountants, lawyers based in the US versus individuals based in Ireland?
Yeah, spot on. It's really just the lack of local legislation, right? So not only will you need to make sure that when you come to the US, you're often going to find that lawyers are licensed to do business in a particular state or on a federal level. So I think the difficult part is being able to find that lawyer that can essentially operate in all 50 states that actually know the legislation of each state, right? So for example, if we said you're incorporated in New York and you essentially want to convert from an LLC to C Corp, and then you have a lawyer that's licensed in Cali, they will not be able to do that for you, right? Nor will a lawyer from Ireland be able to do that. You need to understand what are the local legislations and the tax implications holistically to be able to implement it without hurting your business.
Yeah, absolutely. And that holistic thinking is something that's very important for the US, because sometimes you have to think about it as 50 separate countries rather than one huge country. And I think one of the questions that's actually come in, it's talking conceptually, but it's a software company who's asking if they have clients in different states and employees dotted across different states, how do you decide where to locate your business?
Yeah, it actually goes back to my earlier, it goes back to my earlier discussion, is I would always like to just understand what's important to you as a business, right? And then usually what I find out of those 4 criteria: customers, employees, anticipated warehouse, office locations, and then the tax implications, of course, we can usually find a sweet middle ground. And there's usually like a hub or maybe a top 3 list of states that are really critical, right? So then we whittle it down, and we may have to essentially arrive at your initial state of incorporation, and then you choose to essentially register like a head office somewhere, right? So there is no sort of black and white answer. Essentially, it is almost like a brainstorming session with customers to negotiate what's important to them and then nailing it down, right? And I do see here specifically the question, I think, from Gerard here, right? Like a software company with 2 locations in Nebraska and somewhere in New England. I'm assuming that you mean that you are currently registered in Nebraska, then somewhere in New England, let's just call it Massachusetts, right? And if you want to hire a consultant in California, I would always ask first is, what does this individual do? You might not want to bring on this individual immediately as an employee. As I already mentioned, California is one of the most complex from an employer legislation perspective. So first and foremost is, can he be brought on as a contractor? Usually that's really great. There's certain measures that you want to keep in place with this individual control of his own schedule, shouldn't be promoting, under your company name, etc. But usually you want to test trial that as a contractor first, instead of bringing him on your payroll immediately. If you do find that you do want to hire this individual, tried and tested, which is great, then you will have to register in the state of California. Then I will ask you, what payroll option did you have in place for your Nebraska and New York operations? Is it that standalone payroll? Is it the PEO option? Depending on which one, I would say PEO, no big issue. They will handle everything for you, right? All you would have to do is register in the state of California as an employer. They'll do out the compliance. But if you have your own standalone payroll, then essentially you would have to, I would say, go to the likes of an HSP or an HR expert and really understand what are your employer obligations in California before you extend that offer, so that you understand what you're going to be on the hook for.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of leads into, again, a broader issue that's probably for another webinar, which is the new world of remote working and hiring talent in what is a very competitive landscape. And a lot of employers are choosing to hire remotely because it broadens the talent pool, but with that comes challenges. So for example here, and this is probably our last question, but if an employer was hiring employees remotely from various states, how do they ensure they are compliant with employment law in each state? Have you seen that landscape evolving, or is it a state-by-state basis?
Yeah, I've seen it, especially in the last 3 years. There's been a lot of movement of people where there were hubs of the cities, folks either moving home, etc., creating a lot of headaches for the company. Especially now that we're a couple of years removed from the pandemic, the state legislation is definitely catching up. So you're going to find that there's more audits. Companies are starting to more crack down on movement of people working from different states. Number one, that's a trend we're seeing, not just in the US, but across the globe. And then number 2 is really, I would take another reassessed look at your payroll. Our company as well operates under PEO, and our PEO firm is great. They essentially operate in all 50 states. They're registered in all 50 states. And we essentially have employees in like 20 different states. They take care of all of the compliance for us, right? So it may be a method of, okay, if you know you're going to expand and you have these employees in so many different states, maybe changing your payroll methodology, paying a little bit more to have that ease of mind. If not, then it would be doing your homework and understanding your obligations in each state, either via a firm like HSP, or you can outsource that, or an in-house HR manager. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I always learn a lot, Sally, when I speak to you. And thank you to yourself and Ryder for the great presentation today. I'm sure there are follow-up questions. So if you'd like to take Sally and Ryder's details, please feel free to follow up, and we'll share details after the call as well.